I do think it's important that everybody internalize that this isn't going to be like 2009. And also that, frankly, even 2009 wasn't as much like 2009 as people hoped it would be at the time. Our allies and partners have now lived through this back and forth, and in some ways are starting to come to see it as the norm of American politics, which presents a leader a real challenge. How do I convince you that anything we're doing has staying power?
That's the voice of Heather Hurlburt, Director of the New Models of Policy Change Project at New America's Political Reform Program. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kalina.
Welcome back to Press the Button. This was a very big week here in the United States. Former Vice President Joe Biden and Senator Kamala Harris were declared the winners this Saturday of the U.S. presidential election as updated voting counts moved key swing states into their column.
That is right, Michelle. Even though, as of this recording, President Donald Trump has not yet conceded the race and is continuing to mount legal challenges in various states, but I think his chances of changing the outcome of the election appear increasingly remote, if not impossible. We will get into the national security policy consequences of a Biden victory later in the show. But first, Michelle, what do you have lined up on early warning?
Today, we are taking a look at the Trump administration's strategy for Iran in its remaining weeks in office and what it means for the future of the Iran deal should a Biden White House seek to rejoin the agreement. We're also diving into a new report on how a feminist foreign policy would tackle the nuclear weapons issue in nuclear weapon states.
And after that, Plowshares Fund President Dr. Emma Belcher sits down with Heather Hurlburt, Director of New Models of Policy Change at New America's Political Reform Program. Together, they talk about the sweeping changes a Biden presidency is expected to introduce in American national security policy and what the world can expect from the new administration as it takes the reins in a deeply divided Washington and a divided nation.
And finally, Tom answers a question about the transfer of nuclear authority on this week's Q&A segment. Remember, if you want your question answered on the air, tweet or DM us at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org. I really look forward to these questions every week and really want to make sure we can answer them for you.
As always, please click the subscribe button and give us a rating. Your feedback makes the show better.
With that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today, I'm joined by Marissa Conway, co-founder of the Center for a Feminist Foreign Policy and a grantee of our Women's Initiative, and Mary Kaszynski, Deputy Policy Director here at Plowshares Fund. Thank you both for joining.
Thanks, Michelle. Great to be here.
Thank you. Very excited to be here.
So as you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear news, and our time starts now. Mary, following news of the Biden-Harris victory, what can we expect from the Trump administration regarding Iran in these final weeks before the inauguration?
So a Trump administration official just yesterday gave an interview in which they said that the administration will be doubling down on maximum pressure in these remaining weeks of the current administration by imposing yet more sanctions on Iran. This has been the administration's strategy all along. So they've announced that they're planning to announce new sanctions on Iran every week during the transition period. The goal of these sanctions explicitly is not to address Iran's support for terrorism or ballistic missile activities or any of that. The administration has very clearly said their one and only goal is to prevent the Biden administration from rejoining the nuclear deal.
So This complicates things then for an incoming Biden administration if the administration on the way out is trying to damage everything. What would you advise the Biden administration to do once it assumes office in January?
It's a trap. It's really clearly a trap, and the current administration has made that very clear. It's not even a particularly clever trap. So to be very clear about this strategy, if you can call it that, the Trump administration is imposing sanctions for missiles and terrorism, sanctions that are labeled ballistic missile sanctions or terrorism sanctions. But that's not the goal. The entire goal is just to make it difficult for Biden to lift those sanctions and rejoin the nuclear deal. It's not technically difficult. Biden can lift these sanctions immediately by executive orders and, just directing Treasury officials to lift the sanctions. That's not technically difficult. It's politically difficult, though, right? When you're lifting sanctions on Iran for things like terrorism. So I guess my advice would be don't fall for this. I mean, it's clearly a politically motivated trap. The goal is, again, the goal is to prevent diplomacy with Iran. Pure and simple.
Thanks, Mary. Something we'll be definitely keeping an eye on in the coming weeks. Marissa, your organization recently released a new report called Feminism, Power, and Nuclear Policy, An Eye on the P5. It is a collection of 5 essays that aim to answer the question of when P5 nations engage feminist approaches to foreign policy and nuclear policy, what does this mean? And as a reminder, the P5 are the group of nations allowed under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to have nuclear weapons. So what exactly is a feminist nuclear policy?
So in general, a feminist approach to policy means filtering policy decisions through a feminist lens, which include values based around equality, solidarity, justice, these sorts of things. And it really focuses on understanding power dynamics, both at a local level and a global level, and looking at how people can either access that power or are prevented from accessing that power based around social categories like gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, class, all of these things. So when it comes to nuclear policy, a feminist approach takes a really specific view at how nuclear possessing nations and non-possessing nations, all of this kind of comes together to form this really skewed power dynamic between states and then also at very localized level within states that have nuclear weapons. The system, this hierarchical system is really deeply rooted in toxic masculinity, in racism, in imperialism, and all of this upholds a patriarchal system based on values that are more interested in maintaining power as something that is finite, not something that can be shared. It keeps an elite group of people in charge and excludes everybody else. So when it comes to the P5 particularly, who have this, quote unquote, legal possession of nuclear weapons based on the Non-Proliferation Treaty and also sit as the permanent members of the UN Security Council, they have a very real check on power and on any outside voice coming in to question their work and their policies. And I think this has created a very intense global order based around nuclear weapons that is in desperate need of feminist revisioning.
So these 5 countries are quite diverse. I mean, this is China, the US, Russia, the UK, and France. Were there areas of commonality across the 5 countries that you found as you all were writing these essays?
One of the clear themes, despite the different contexts that all of these countries operate in, is a disinterest in hearing alternative views on nuclear policy. And this sort of sets up a system where a very specific type of person is accepted as a good policymaker, and other people are just simply ignored. Their voices are not welcomed, essentially. And particularly when we're dealing with the most destructive force in the world, it makes sense that you would want to have as many possible options, opinions, life experiences on the table to help inform this policy. So we are making the best decisions we possibly can make with this massive power. So I think the exclusionary methods of these countries were pretty clear throughout these different pieces. And I think a real desperation to cling to these very specific masculinized ideas of power came through very strongly. And ultimately, that leads us down the road of really intense themes of gender inequality specifically, as well as racial inequality, and really strong themes of nuclear colonialism as well.
So if our listeners want to read the report, where can they find it?
They can find it on our website. It's centerforfeministforeignpolicy.org. There is a reports tab, which you click on that, and it'll take you right to it.
And with that, our time is up. Marissa and Mary, thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
I'm pleased to be joined now by a recurring guest, Heather Hurlburt, the director of the New Models of Policy Change project at New America's Political Reform Program. There, she leads research into how policy advocacy can be effective in a time of intense polarisation and while navigating the political landscape in pursuit of solutions on issues such as national security and climate change. You may have seen her writings in Politico, Foreign Affairs, The National Interest, Fortune, Vox, and Time, among other places. Heather, it's so good to have you on.
I don't know, Emma. Recurring guest sounds like part of a rap sheet, but it's great to be back, and it's great to do this with you.
Terrific. Thanks, Heather. And before we go any further, I want to give our listeners a sense of when we're talking. Right now, it's about mid-afternoon on Friday, November 6th. As of this moment, neither Vice President Biden nor President Trump have crossed the threshold of 270 electoral votes. However, overnight and into this morning, Biden has taken narrow lead in both Pennsylvania and Georgia and has retained his edge in both Arizona and Nevada, putting him on the verge of victory and giving us the confidence to talk about the policy implications of his win. So let's start there, Heather. Really, throughout their respective campaigns, national security has been a major area of disagreement between the two candidates. So what sort of policy changes do you think we can expect from a Biden presidency?
So there are, I think, going to be some huge changes right off the bat. Biden was already confirming yesterday, as the U.S. pullout from the Paris Climate Agreement became official, that the U.S. would go back in. So you'll see just overall a return to a multilateral approach to the world, a return to engagement in multilateral fora, but not just engagement, a return to interest in solving problems multilaterally, which, you know, has relevance in the nuclear sphere, but also, of course, has a lot of resonance as far as we go with COVID right now, as well as climate and a whole range of other issues. You'll see the U.S. getting back into some big international conversations, like how to manage growing migration that it had completely exited in recent years, and an interest in collaborative problem-solving efforts of the kind that brought us the Iran nuclear deal, of the kind where you used to see efforts at Middle East peace in concert with other countries, just for starters.
Great. And maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on how you see this interest in multilateralism specifically play out in the nuclear field. You mentioned the Iran nuclear deal. You know, what other aspects might you see there, opportunities or interest of a Biden administration along those lines?
Well, you know, first, the Trump administration very much brought to the table the idea that international relations is a zero-sum game, and that partnerships in international relations are based, when they're based at all, on shared short-term interests, which tended to cluster around a kind of ethno-nationalism, sort of, we will have our ethno-nationalism and we will partner with other countries that have their ethno-nationalism, rather than the idea that some threats are shared, some opportunities are shared. And specifically, when we came to nuclear weapons, there tended to be, you know, this almost cartoonish, you know, more nuclear weapons are better approach from the Trump administration, and an eagerness to move toward thinking about warfighting, frankly, with nuclear weapons, whether that was reflected in rhetoric around North Korea, whether it was reflected in indifference and hostility to the fundamental goal of the Iran deal, or whether it was reflected in the budget and planning processes at the Pentagon that were moving us steadily toward resuming nuclear testing. So those are all areas where you're going to see reversals. Now, that is not the same as saying you're going to see dramatic new initiatives on any of those fronts, I think. And a thing that's we're just going to have to underline over and over in this conversation is that this president is going to come to office during a pandemic, during a prolonged economic crisis, and with whatever we get is the final results in Congress, you're not going to have a big legislative cushion for anything you want to do, whether that's changes in spending or whether that's treaty agreements. So, huge changes from where we are right now. Do you see a dramatically different trajectory in the nuclear space, a dramatic sort of new vision? Not in the first 6 months to a year, because there's all these sort of, it's the classic immediate driving out the important, only in this case, everything is both immediate and important.
How do you think it's going to be for President Biden to navigate relationships, particularly with allies, whose relationships might have been damaged over the last few years of the Trump administration? What do you think is the repair works that's necessary, and how might those relationships be changed, if at all, in the immediate future?
Well, the one thing that's actually a huge advantage is that in many cases, Biden will have known these folks personally for, in some cases, 20, 30, 40 years because of his long tenure on Senate Foreign Relations. And I just actually read somewhere that he was believed to be the most traveled member of Senate Foreign Relations. So he really does, any country you drop him in, the chances that he either knows the leader or someone close to leadership is very good. And he is someone who, distinct from maybe both the way the Trump administration operated and a little bit differently from how President Obama operated, he very much operates on personal relationship. So that, in some ways, he's the perfect person for this task. I do think it's important that everybody internalize that this isn't going to be like 2009. And also that, frankly, even 2009 wasn't as much like 2009 as people hoped it would be at the time. Our allies and partners have now lived through this back and forth, and in some ways are starting to come to see it as the norm of American politics, which presents a leader a real challenge. How do I convince you that anything we're doing has staying power? And that, maybe your what you think of, what you prioritize as an American president needs to be a little different to think about building habits and structures of cooperation that are both forward-looking and also harder to destroy. A European colleague put it very interestingly to me in saying, we just have to not get complacent again. And I thought, you have to not get complacent again. But yeah.
One of the wild cards in all of this, bringing it back to the election, is we don't yet know whether Democrats or Republicans will hold the majority in the Senate. So we have potentially 2 runoff elections in Georgia in January that could really decide the fate of the chamber. So how would either scenario with a Republican or Democratic Senate affect the Biden presidency when it comes to national security policy?
So as opposed to some other issues, I don't actually think it's going to be so close either way that this is going to, it's not as momentous for this field as it is for maybe some other fields, and particularly for issue sets that you can do more things in Congress on a straight up and down vote than you can, frankly, in international affairs. So I think the key, we can all start thinking about, number one, living in a gridlock world, which is not a very cheerful and happy thing to think about. Number two, though, is this coalition point that I was mentioning, that you, as a policy entrepreneur, you are going to be potentially able to mean, American political parties are just big coalitions, right? And so they're always, for entrepreneurs, available to be broken up and reassembled in interesting ways around specific ideas. But then there's also, frankly, a longer term goal of how do we want to cast this issue? Who do we want to be the champions of this issue in 5 years? And what do they look like? I mean, if you think about, maybe instead of fixating on the last two, or in addition to fixating on the last two seats to be decided, think about the really interesting crop and wildly diverse, by the way, by the standards of the US Congress, both physically and ideologically, new members, and sort of where does the field want to position itself? And are there lessons learned that we should be applying to the class of 2020? So as much as tempting as it is to just order up another round of your favorite stress snack and kind of settle in for those Georgia Senate races, really think about all these other sort of new folks from a very wide range of backgrounds, including maybe some people you wouldn't expect with backgrounds you wouldn't expect on this issue set.
And I guess that sort of leads a little bit to what I wanted to ask you about is, the narrative that came out of the campaign season is the divided nature of today's Democratic Party, with progressives on the left calling for much more revolutionary change and moderates in the centre preferring incremental reform. How do you see what's going on in the Democratic Party resolving itself over the next couple of years?
So, one of the lessons that one can take out of the way this election unfolded is that the Democratic Party needs both its progressives and its moderates, that it actually neither faction either is strong enough politically or, frankly, is in sole possession of all the good ideas needed to move forward by itself. And that is a hard lesson, and it's not necessarily how the season of trying to accrue political power, which is to say campaigning, works. But when it comes to governing, I think an equally useful way of thinking about the moment that we're in is that we actually need a whole raft of new ideas and new approaches to some of these issues, either because the old approaches didn't work or because, frankly, the old contours of the situation have been changed so dramatically, either by things the Trump administration did or other ways that the world kind of went on and changed while the Trump administration was sending love notes to Pyongyang. So in many cases where we're going to be tempted to think about this as progressive versus moderate, I think it's going to be at least as useful, and certainly for those of us who sit in the ideas space, to spend our time thinking about what are new ideas, what are new approaches that can transcend some of the ruts that we're stuck in, and what are ways that we can bring those approaches forward that build coalitions among progressives, moderates, and then, frankly, both the wing of the Republican Party that is internationalist and or the wing of the Republican Party that is anti-war. So you have kind of a really interesting mobile geometry potentially for coalitions that can form behind interesting new approaches to nuclear and security policy. And that to my mind is the longer term business we're all in right now.
Mm-hmm. And you do work in the area of ideas and idea generation. What do you need, do you think? Who needs to be at the table in terms of developing some of these ideas for the longer term?
Well, that is such a great question. Thank you for subtly leading me into that. Because again, one of the things, so we've seen within the nuclear field, within our field, with a lot of support from your wonderful colleagues, an enormous groundswell of interest in really making sure the nuclear field responds to the other pandemic, the pandemic of racism that we've had very much impressed upon us in this country the last 6 months, as well as the other isms, other forms of bigotry and discrimination that have warped and shaped our field. And so we have that pressure coming from the inside, which is really great. And then if you look at how the campaign unfolded and how the election unfolded, we have these different parts of our American public, all of whom think that they're voting and looking for leaders who will protect them, but who define what security is, who gives them security and who's a risk to their security very differently. So a bigger piece of this problem that I think the nuclear space is going to have to reckon with is not just how do we make ourselves look more like America? How do we get our country to the table? But also, how do we fit ourselves into this redefinition and broadening of how we all think about security and threats to security and what tools we use to respond to them? So the challenge is much bigger than diversity, equity, inclusion within the nuclear field. It's really rethinking what the field is and how it fits in with an understanding of security, sort of that encompasses the world we're living in and the very different experiences that different groups of Americans have.
You make a really good case for that. Do you think we're up to the challenge?
Well, at 4:30 on a sunny Friday afternoon, where it looks to me like we're going to have a new president who got more votes than any president's ever gotten, and also had an election in which a higher percentage of Americans turned out than has ever been the case. I think there are reasons for optimism. There are also important reasons for concern. Including, we really have to look at ourselves and how much of the field is structured to reward things going on exactly as they were. And that's a fun critique to make of somebody else, but it's also a critique that, all of us, and particularly any of us who've been around any length of time and have managed to build a little nest for ourselves, have to level at ourselves too. Not to get corny, but this starts at home in a very localized way within our own institutions.
And so lastly, whatever the final results are, I think it's safe to say that this year's elections have put more strain than we're used to seeing on the democratic process as a whole. So this is a tough question to answer, but bigger picture, do you have any thoughts on what changes might be needed to strengthen our democratic institutions and the electoral process?
Yeah, so obviously this is a whole sector, and I have many wonderful colleagues at New America who think a lot about this from the domestic perspective. But the most fundamental thing we can do is to continue trying to push back and get rid of voter suppression. Everything else starts from Americans having confidence that they can vote and that their vote counts and is meaningful. And flowing from that, you can then imagine a whole raft of other reforms. What do districts look like? What do election processes look like? It's fun to talk about getting rid of the Electoral College, which is a relic of an agrarian slave society. There's lots and lots of fun things that you can talk about, but all of those things have power implications. And so nobody who benefits from them is going to say, oh, heck, so therefore, the place that we do, and as Stacey Abrams and all the people who worked with her in Georgia, but also the folks who went out and organized Native American communities in Arizona, and the folks who did inner city organizing, and the folks who did union organizing, and the folks who organized what looks like an incredible surge on the Republican side, by the way, where there are lots of first-time Republican voters out there as well. So that, and of course, many of the policy steps to fix voter suppression need to happen at the state level. So that's an area that everybody can get involved in an extracurricular way, wherever you live, whatever you do. And then building from that, I think, is where we can kind of think about all these other sort of fancy changes that everyone loves to debate.
Right. Terrific. Thank you so much for joining us today. And where can people go to learn more about you and New America?
Oh, thanks. So you can find us at newamerica.org. And you can find me on Twitter at NatSecHeather. And I will just say, as we're drawing to a close, I won't lie. I have had my phone sitting next to me, and I was really hoping maybe this thing would get called while we were recording, and you could have gotten to hear me scream very loud. But you will have to tune in another time for that one. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you, Heather. I'm so disappointed we didn't get to that point to hear you scream. I know there'll be screams around the place when we finally have a result. But thanks so much for coming on, and we can't wait to have you back.
Thanks much. And it's wonderful to have you here.
Oh, terrific. Thank you very much.
My name is Alyssa Karim, and I'm the Development Associate at Plowshares Fund. I'm also a contributor to and a dedicated listener of the Press the Button podcast. I believe it is critical that millennials like myself learn and speak out about foreign policy issues. That's why in-depth and honest discussions about nuclear policy and national security, like the ones on this podcast, are so important. To help us continue our work at Plowshares Fund, and to keep the forward-moving conversations going each week with Press the Button, we rely upon the generosity of supporters and listeners like you. Whether you donate $5 or $50 to Plowshares Fund, your generosity is how we keep the world informed on the dangers of nuclear weapons. If you like what you're hearing on Press the Button and want to support the work of Plowshares Fund, please donate today. Visit plowshares.org to make a monthly or a one-time donation. Be a part of our vision of a world where nuclear weapons can never be used again. Thank you for listening.
Letters, we get letters, we get stacks and stacks of letters.
And now, everyone's favorite nuclear Q&A segment. This week's question, which is very timely, comes from Chris in Virginia and will be answered by Tom. Tom, are you ready for this?
Yes, I am, Michelle. Bring it on.
Chris asks, now that Biden has won the presidency, when does he take over the nuclear button? And what is the process for that?
Chris, thank you very much. Great question. The election may be over, but President Trump is still the president until January 20th of next year. And so he has all of the powers of the presidency until then, including sole authority over the launch of U.S. nuclear weapons. So we have not cleared that hurdle yet. Until January 20th, the president still has his finger on the button. That day, Inauguration Day, January 20th, around noon, whenever President-elect Biden is sworn in, he will then get the football, which is the satchel that contains everything the president needs to order the launch of nuclear weapons. And at that point, and not before, will the authority shift from President Trump to then incoming President Joe Biden. And yes, it is true that until then, President Trump could still launch the weapons. I certainly hope he will not do so. I think the chances of President Trump starting a nuclear war in the next few months are very slim. But I have to note that even the fact that we're even thinking about it, that people are questioning it or worrying about it, kind of proves the point. Is that we should not have this authority in the hands of any one person. I think many of us will feel some relief when that authority is switched from President Trump to a President Biden. But in fact, we should not, because this isn't ultimately about who has their finger on the button, but the fact that there's a button at all that can be pushed so quickly, which is why we've been saying it's really not about Trump or Biden. It's that no one person, no single person should have the authority to end the world within minutes, particularly when that decision must be made within minutes based on imperfect information under crushing time pressures, when it may be in response to a false alarm. And, the scenario that worries us the most is a cyber attack that affects our command and control and early warning system, that it appears that a launch is coming, say from Russia, of hundreds of nuclear weapons, but in fact, it's a cyber hack and the attack is not real. And so the president needs to wait until it's clear that the attack, if real, is a real attack and isn't a phantom attack, as they say. And the only way to avoid that is to change our policies. The president should not have sole authority. particularly not for first use. And so we would like to see a Biden administration move away from first use policy to only a second strike, deterrence only posture. And we would like to see the new administration get rid of the weapons that are most prone to first use and quick use. And those are our land-based ballistic missiles, our ICBMs, that are out in the Midwest. Those weapons should be retired. And that won't completely solve the problem. Ultimately, the elimination of nuclear weapons will solve this problem, but we can be a lot safer, be in a situation that's a lot less risky if we get away from first use and we get away from ICBMs.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Tom. And thank you, Chris. And remember, if you would like to get your question on the air, tweet or DM us at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Sender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Sender. Audio engineering by Derek Sender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.